Hello, I'm Tim Armstrong. I'm Head of Department at Royal Holloway, University of London. I'm going to talk today about Toni Morrison's Beloved. Beloved is a novel of fragments, fragmented narrative, as any reader quickly understands. And for that reason, it's very hard to sum up. Everyone notices the way it's told in fits and starts, in loopings back, in sudden revelations, and things which you know or half know, but then find that you don't really know. Where in the text is the actual murder of the child? As Morrison herself has commented, it's easy to overlook it, actually, to go past it, though its presence is there from the outlook. What you also notice rereading the book, I think, is that it's a different novel for different people. Denver's novel is different from Setha's. Her relation to the ghost is quite different, as she has more to learn from it. Paul D's relationship to the legacy of slavery is different again, and that of the dysfunctional, immediate post-slavery community in the text is different again. It has to make its own accommodation with these events and with what Beloved represents. So that too takes a different trajectory. So it's a novel of quite different perspectives, despite the fact that it has a very intense, tight set of relations, really between three women at its core. For that reason, I think you have to work very hard to put the perspectives together, to understand the different parts, and to understand Beloved herself, since she, of course, has a soliloquy at the heart of the text. I'll talk about a few topics in the novel, just key words really. Firstly, memory. And the question there really is, what is lost? What is lost in particular in the experience of slavery? And what is lost there includes history, people from Africa who were stripped of identity, language, family, culture, and taken across the Atlantic. What is also lost is selfhood, since the slave is a person who technically has no selfhood, who's a kind of living, in a state of living death. And that includes, in the novel, the lost language of Africa, what Nan told her she had forgotten, along with the language she told it in, the same language her mother spoke, and which would never come back. That's how Setha describes the language of the old slaves around her, the language of Africa. And of course, that is involved in Beloved, since she's a child of the Middle Passage, of history, not just of Setha or of the person on whom Setha's modelled, Margaret Garner. So in that crucial section where the Middle Passage, that is the transition from Africa to America, is evoked, all of those lost to history, the 60 million or more who are evoked in the dedication of the novel, come into play. That's the I am beloved and she is mine section, the soliloquy, which involves a description of the hold of a slave ship and of the people who are trying to leave their bodies behind, a description of the making of ghosts. The novel's rememory is a response to that, all that loss, that loss of memory, of Africa, of history, of language, of culture, people, the dead, and it's, of course, a literal re-embodiment of those ghosts, as well as the story of their eventual dispersal, of the way that one might deal with them. Sacrifice. W.E.B. Du Bois, in his great turn-of-the-century text, The Souls of Black Folk, has a chapter called On the Passing of the Firstborn, where he describes the death of his son. And he describes it as, in part, a liberation from the world of racism in America. His son is too young to understand race, to have it enter his world. But it's also a sacrifice which is too much. The cost is too much for Du Bois. He has to forego too much, he says, and it creates a kind of melancholy in the writer, and I think at the heart of the community that lives under these conditions. And Beloved is a text which is concerned with the passing on of that melancholy, of its inheritance for an African American community. For Morrison, that's a community which must remember these events and understand them. She tells a story in one of her interviews of a friend who's teaching young black children, and they know all about racism, they're quite smart, but they learn that black people came to America as slaves, and they didn't know that. They're amazed by that fact. And Morrison says, who didn't tell them? How do they not know? She thinks that it's absolutely vital that that is known and understood. That leads us to another word, passing. The end of the novel uses that term 3 times. It was not a story to pass on. She says that twice. And then she says, this is not a story to pass on. What does that mean? Although she has claim, she is not claim, she says of Beloved in the end. So the questions that she's raising there include the question of whether this inheritance of memory that she's evoking, remembering, putting back together, isn't toxic, isn't something that you should in fact choose not to pass on. But she's also using passing in the sense of passing over. It's not a story to not acknowledge. And passing in the common black sense of passing as white. This is not a story that you should say is not yours, because your conditions are better, because you're, say, like her, middle class. This is a story that you have to acknowledge the burden of. And finally, she's perhaps even using passing in a third sense of reverse passing. This is not a story that white people should read and simply assume they can understand easily. That because in some ways I think students do get a kind of melodramatic pleasure at times from reading Beloved, from identifying with the pain of its characters. And I think Morrison may even be saying that that's not something you should take easily. You shouldn't assume it's your burden. It's a burden that you have to understand in others. And there you might think of the way that we often understand the blues as the transmitted pain of a black inheritance, but one which gives a white audience pleasure. What does it mean to think about the source of that pain and to try to understand it rather than simply to sort of project your own emotions into it? So Beloved in that sense, particularly in its ending, I think, is asking about the status of the story you've just read. A final word from that mysterious ending of the novel, weather. The novel ends like this. By and by, all trace is gone, and what is forgotten is not only the footprints, but the water too, and what it is down there. The rest is weather, not the breath of the disremembered and unaccounted for, but wind in the eaves, or spring ice thawing too quickly. Just weather, certainly no clamour for a kiss, Beloved. I think weather in the novel refers to the everyday. It refers to that which we live with, which comes and goes, which passes over us, which might be the climate of a region like the American South, but which we all deal with, which we harden our skin to. I think there's a kind of politics of the weather in African American writing often. And weather is opposed in this novel to trauma, to that which won't go away, which endures in a timeless fashion, like Beloved, who's a kind of child out of time. And you'll notice in the novel as you read through that there are lots of references to weather. For example, in relation to Sethe, here she might be running across a field, running practically just to get the pump quickly and rinse the chamomile sap from her legs. Nothing else would be in her mind, nothing, just the breeze cooling her face as she rushed towards water. So in such moments she'll suddenly remember the traumatic past. Every day she saw the dawn, but never acknowledged or remarked its cover. There was something wrong with that. It was as though one day she saw baby blood, another day the pink gravestone chips, and that was the last of it. And similarly, Denver will forego the most violent of sunsets, stars as fat as dinner plates, and all the blood of autumn, and settle for the palest yellow if it comes from Beloved. So weather is stopped or ruled out for those who are traumatized under Beloved's influence. And in contrast, Paul D is the man who follows the blossoms, the seasonal drift of colour to escape slavery, who remains astonished by the beauty of the land that was not his. And it's Paul D who made fun of the weather and what it was doing to him. So weather in the novel is something that involves a return to the everyday from trauma. And I think if you think about that in relation particularly to the climactic episode where Beloved is dissipated by the song of the community, the song of the woman who find the right note and undo the cipher, as it's described, the code which is Beloved. I think at that point you see a return to weather, which is signalled by the blue sky, by the dissipating clouds, by a return to the possibilities, at least, of everyday life after this traumatic intervention.